All right. I think Cora was in for a second, but might be coming back. And let's see. I'm gonna- Okay, I'm gonna put the chat over there. All right, so this is lecture, the third lecture for Unit 2. In Unit 2, we've already gone through, I've kind of done some overviews, depending on different Zoom sessions. But in terms of an actual, fully fleshed out lecture, I've done the first part on ancient civilizations, the second part on the axial age. And those have both been posted and have been sent to you guys via messaging on Canvas. And then earlier this morning, I did a third lecture on ceramics. And that, um, let me just before we get to the official lecture I'm going to do today, just want to say again that you don't necessarily have to know all of these, but it's important to know in terms of in ceramics, make sure that you know what an amphora is. Um, I also recommend knowing what a kylix is. It's just one of my favorites. It's a drinking vessel. Um, but knowing what an amphora looks like, the definition of an amphora is going to be on the test, and also you have to make your own ceramic version in Unit 2, actually. And so there you go. All right, so we're going to begin. Now, I'm primarily going to be talking about figure ground, but before talking about figure ground, there's some things I need to say about shape. Um, go back. There we go. And so, like always, with each lecture, there is kind of a starting page. Starting page has a very broad outline. As you can see, this is a very broad outline, very bare bones, and a little bit of some description of what we're going to be learning about. And so, the fact of the matter is that every work of art has shapes, right? Every two-dimensional work of art. Like let's look at these for right now. And there are countless shapes, like this right there is a shape. And this negative space place right there, not including that dark shadow, that's a separate shape. That's a shape, right? There's shapes within shapes within shapes. Every painting, every print, every drawing. Um, Now, drawings can be more dependent on line, but there's still shapes being created. One of the fundamental, well, we'll talk about how you make shapes in a little bit. Um, so there's shapes all over. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that some paintings are a lot more explicit about us seeing the shapes, right? They're much more willing to be painted flat, like every shape is a flat shape. And other paintings are doing the exact same thing, but they're just, whether it's just with playing with the softness of edges between some of the shapes or just various decisions. Like when you look at Vermeer, it's really hard for you to see it as a collection of shapes. Instead, you see it as a woman in a room. There is no woman, there is no room, right? It doesn't exist at all, right? It's purely illusionary. It is just a painting. It's just a collection of shapes, but it's hard to see that. So, but we'll get on. So, different kinds of shapes. There are lots of different kinds of shapes. And we can go through this list, but I think the most important thing about this list is that categorizing the different kinds of shapes is, to me, somewhat useless, unimportant. Like there are a lot of art textbooks, a lot of art appreciation textbooks spend a lot of time talking about the difference between organic shapes and non-organic and geometric shapes. And that's true. But I think like fundamentally, there's a difference between things being regular versus irregular, right? It's just a broad spectrum. But then there's so much variety within that. But the the irregular things, right? The irregular lines can be much more specific, but the regular ones can be much more alluding to kind of like the perfection of geometry, right? So a circle is probably the ideal of a regular shape, but irregular shapes are, there is no perfect ideal, right? Like whether it's this shape right there or that shape right there, irregular shapes are um, as varied as they can be, like they're infinite. So a more important question, besides like what kinds of shapes are there, is the question of how do we create shapes? And yeah, there are three major ways. What are those three major ways? Well, we all know one. One way is delineation, right? That is, if I told you, and is there, nope, there's no one here in chat yet, but if I told you, any random you person, draw a triangle for me. Like let's say we're in class. Everyone has a white piece of paper. Everyone has a pen or a pencil. Say, okay, everyone draw me a triangle. 99% of people in the class would draw a triangle this way, right? That is not the only way you can draw a triangle, but it's like the first thing that comes to mind, which is I will draw a line that represents the outside boundary of that triangle. Everything within that boundary line is the triangle. Everything outside that boundary line is not the triangle, right? That's the basic rule of how delineation and outlines work. But you could do it another way. Like if everyone had two pieces of paper and they had a pencil, but they also had a pair of scissors. Well, some people could just cut out, let's say one piece of paper was gray and one piece of paper was white. They could just cut out one triangle and then stick it on the other piece of paper and say, I made a triangle that way. There is no outline in that case, but there's still a triangle, there's still a shape. So another way to create a shape is what we might call color fill or value fill, right? Or just edge, right? Like just that there's an edge between all the area that is this color, this texture, this value, and all the area that is different. Okay. But there are also, this is where things get fun. The shapes can also exist in our heads, really. They can exist as implied shapes. And this is through grouping and so this is a good example of grouping creating an implied shape. This is a much more complex way of creating an implied shape using kind of like plays on figure ground. We'll get to figure ground in a second. But let's look at all the possible ways. As long as we embrace the idea that we can make a shape, but not through delineation, we can see all these possibilities of how we can make shapes, right? We can make a rectangle right there, right? We could make, now, is that a circle or is that a pentagon? That kind of depends on your interpretation, but we can clearly see this peanut-like shape or the triangle. There's no debate about that. Two different ways of making S's, right? So, and there's really an infinite number of shapes or infinite number of ways of creating shapes. Once you embrace the idea that the third option of not doing it through fill, not doing it through delineation, but doing it through some other form of implied shape. There you go. All right, so bigger question is, besides how do we create shapes? So the least important question is, what are the different kinds of shapes from the point of view of an artist? A more important question is, how do we create shapes? Maybe an even more important question than that is, how are shapes used? Okay. And so when we say how are shapes used, one of the ways that shapes are used in paintings is something, whoa, don't do that. Do it once again. Whoa, it's naughty. Okay. So it's something called meta shapes, right? Or shape grouping, where artists kind of plan out a painting where they think of a series of shapes all grouping together to make a larger shape. So we have two different kinds of grouping. We have sort of geometric grouping going on here um, in The Raft of Medusa by Géricault. By the way, this painting right here is one that will show up multiple times, multiple tests. Just saying right now, you need to know it. So the Raft of the Medusa, later on we'll talk about some of the story, some of the meaning behind the painting. But for right now, all we're thinking about is shapes. So there's geometric shape organization, and we'll get to that. But before we get to that, there's also value shape organization. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at this painting, but squint your eyes. I'm going to squint my eyes, right? Squint really hard, right? So that when you squint, all the dark shapes all start to group together, and all the light shapes, whether there are one person or multiple people, right? So the light shape that like is this leg into this abdomen, lower torso. We got the thoracic arch right there, goes right into the light shape on this arm, right around up to the top, right? So all that whole grouping of light value all becomes one shape. And then when we squint our eyes and look at it, we see that all of those shapes kind of twist and turn and move our eye through the whole composition. So it's really not so much about a painting of a bunch of people. It's a painting of a bunch of dark shapes and mid-value shapes and light value shapes that kind of writhe and move our eye from one place to the other in the composition. So that would be value-based meta shape organization. Whereas there's also a much more kind of much more obvious, I guess. Like there's also this kind of geometric thinking. He is thinking of the whole thing being organized into two large triangles, right? So there's like triangle one, right, which is a little bit smaller, and then this bigger triangle, triangle two. And those two big triangles, and this is kind of a common, we'll talk about this later at the more towards the end of the class, but there's a common compositional device where in the Renaissance, triangular compositions were very popular, but they tended to be centered and they were very stable. Then triangular compositions went kind of a little bit out of favor in the Baroque, and there were other alternative types of modes of composition. But triangles returned in the Romantic period, but they tended to be instead of they tended to do things like this, where he's using double triangles, but also where neither triangle is centered. They're both very active, angled away, kind of like angled in direction kind of triangles. So we have like one triangle that's going here. It's really kind of moving and pushing us in one direction. Then we have this other active triangle here, which either could be this way or that way, depending on how you want to think about it. So this kind of double triangle and this sort of like very asymmetrical angled triangle is a very common, or not common, pretty common in the Romantic period. Okay, back to, so here's another example of shape and meta shape thinking. And a lot of it is thinking about value. One of the things Bonnard loved to do is he loved to kind of like play with like where one color bleeds into another color, so that there would be, if I can find a kind of a good example of this, well, like the way the color of the table kind of bleeds into the color of the plate right there, or the way the color of the floor kind of bleeds into the side of the chair right there, or how this is probably best, the windowsill and the side of the chair and the arm really all become like one area of color. They're just slight modulations shifting between each other. And yeah, I love that about Bonnard. It makes the paintings extra playful. There's just so much love and thought about color and shape going on in just any Bonnard painting. He was a genius. So how shapes are organized, right? It's way more important than what kinds of shapes are used. And another huge difference that I think, and we already kind of covered this a little bit, is how obvious are the use of shapes, and how, what's the word I'm looking for? I have it right here somewhere, don't I? How explicit, I guess, is the word I'm looking for, right? Like how directly explicit is the artist about these are shapes, right? Like when we look at this ceramic vessel, we can see the shapes very clearly, especially the negative space shapes. The artist is making no attempt to try to hide it by saying, look, it's really like modulation of tone back there. It's just a flat black shape, right? The Vermeer is also a very carefully organized set of shapes. It's all about shape. And yet when we look at it, because so many of the shapes are these soft little modulations from one little shift in value and color to another little shift in value and color, what we see is we see the space, we see the light, we see the figure. We we believe in all those things, and so we don't really believe in the abstraction of the shapes, which are really there. The shapes are, it is just a collection of painted shapes on a flat painted surface. I promise you. So here's another two examples of artists who are being playful, right? Once again, we've got another Bonnard being playful with how much they're making the use of shapes really kind of obvious and to the point, especially more so with Dievenkorn. Okay, and that leads us to the next lecture, which is on figure ground. And so figure ground, I'm going to get back to the first page in a second, but I just want to say, like, our discussion of black figure in Greek ceramics is the primary reason why we're talking about figure ground here at this point. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about figure ground in design, and then in painting and photography. And we're just going to look at a lot of art. It's going to be fun. Okay. So I should have another page where I go into more detail with the Greek ceramics. Maybe we should go back just for a second so we can really remember what we were talking about. Yep, yep. There we go. Okay, so black figure looked like this. And like I said before, in black figure, the artist is thinking kind of like in a more literal way, just automatically, because the background is just the flat background of the red of the clay. And then the figures, the actual things or persons in the painting are painted in black. And then the lines are scratched away. And then this is a little bit more or a little less abstract because the artist is painting like the literal thing that the literal shape they paint is the literal thing that they're representing. That's a person, and it's the literal mark that they're making. In red figure, that gets flipped, right? Red figure is much more naturalistic, in part because it's way more abstract. That is a interesting statement, and I want you, when we get to our lecture on representation, I want you to think about that statement again, that red figure is much more naturalistic because it is way more abstract. It's way more abstract because the artist is much more thinking about the shapes. They're painting the negative space shapes as a way of creating the positive shape of the figure by leaving the figure pretty much alone, right? The figure is just the color of the clay. So, okay, getting back to our lecture on figure ground. So, we start with talking about red figure and black figure. But I also want to talk about how the thing about figure ground is that there are some really obvious examples, and that's kind of like how a lot of times beginning students learn it. Like in a basic design class, a lot of students will be given assignments where they do some kind of figure ground reversal like this, where you have shapes that are very positive on a white space, like they're black mark shapes on a white space. And then by the time we get to another part of the composition, it's flipped. What were the negative space shapes become now they become fish. And then those fish become more and more detailed. And then it's just a positive thing, a positive mark on the dark space. Okay, so that's a classic Escher example, and it's a classic kind of design assignment for students. But these very kind of obvious sort of examples, like the FedEx arrow. Does everyone know the FedEx arrow? The arrow that is created right here in the intersection between the E and the X. These kind of obvious examples are not all there is, right? That there's a lot more to figure ground. And we're going to get to that, especially when we get to the end of this lecture and we're talking about painting and photography. So playing with figure ground reversals and figure ground ambiguity is really important in a lot of design for two reasons. One, because it's catchy, right? It's like it draws your attention. You're like, oh, that's interesting. What was red? What was positive is now negative. Wow, right? You know, like your brain just it's like a particular kind of pleasure that your brain likes, right? And then the other thing about it is, and why it's really particularly popular with designers and in the design world, is it's efficient because you're literally, because you're playing around and flipping was positive and negative, you can turn the what was, hold on a second. Let's see if there's, oh, I thought there might have been some text down there. You can flip what it was positive or flip, and have multiple pieces of information overlapping each other, right? So like the Pixar Brave poster right there. That was not a poster for the movie. That was a promotional poster for the production of the movie back when the movie was in production. And that was like at I think it was probably Comic-Con in San Diego. Yeah, it does say that. So a really good example of this kind of playing with figure ground is the work of this young designer. I say young, he's probably in his late 30s by now, Tang Yao Hong, who he was a Malaysian, I think, yeah, Malaysian designer. And when graduating from art school, didn't immediately get a graphic design position. So he started to just make a portfolio, just making work to try to sell himself. And he really enjoyed doing digital illustrations where they are flips on figure ground play. And so like the iceberg, but then it's also, see, here's the cityscape, or the two figures make the McDonald's, or the lines of the book are the lines of the pages, but then they become the trees that Red Riding Hood is in, or the crocodile or alligator and then the guy's fishing, right? Or also how the lines here are the negative space, but then they become the positive of like branches that then the birds are on. These are all pretty clever. And there are fine artists, like non-designer artists, who also really are obsessed with the positive and negative. Ellsworth Kelly is very much that's very much part of his whole way of thinking. In fact, like these shaped canvas paintings, the process where he finds him is a lot of times through his photography and his drawing. He will he will often do like these very compositions that are very much focused on negative space shapes, and then he'll find a shape like this, and then think about the most kind of like simple geometric version of that shape to make that he'll then make a shape like a canvas. Either make a canvas where it's like it's a rectangle and then that is the one shape in the painting, or paintings like this where they are just simply a single color floating on the wall. Gary Hume is a British artist who's also very much interested in the play between positive and negative. And I think he really enjoys it because of its aspect of being able to like hide imagery or play with what what you know about the imagery, like things get flattened out, things get a little bit hard to understand and to read. He also really loves paint surface, like the way he paints, he fills in all the surfaces like by paint pour to make each of the areas. Alex Katz is an amazing painter who um, has always been really interested and obsessed with the relationship of positive and negative space. I love his landscape paintings. And so in graphic design, like I said before, the play of positive and negative is very interesting to designers and illustrators for a number of reasons. And whether it's like actual figure ground flips or like this kind of play with positive and negative, right? Like where to see how, like, so this shape is positive, but it also makes that internal black shape really important, right? It's all about, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of an aside. One of the reasons why figure ground, even though it's not one of the design principles, if it's ever on the list of design principles, one of the reasons why it's one of the most important things to teach beginning design students, why almost everywhere design students have a figure ground assignment somewhere in their design education, whether they're going on to be painters or going on to be graphic designers. One of the reasons why it's so critical is because being aware that the negative space shapes, those negative shapes are just as interesting and just as important, or can be just as interesting and just as important. And that the good design is about using both the positive shapes that you have available to you and the negative space shapes that you have available to you, and like consciously thinking of them both as choices and as decisions that can be used. Learning to do that is key to learning to be a good designer, because you have to be aware of shape. And if you're only aware of positive shape, you're missing half of them, right? You're like half blind. So you have to be aware of positive and negative shapes, and you have to be aware of the interaction, the push and pull between them. And so a design like this is all about thinking about the relationship between positive and negative and playing it. And so by putting it really small right there, really makes you think about that empty space, about the shape that is created by the lack of the positive thing being, because the positive thing is so small. All right, positive and negative in painting. We see a lot of it in painting as well. And I just love this painting right here. It's a great example. The thing, I remember seeing some Monet paintings in Chicago the first time I went to the Art Institute, and I just loved how it made you so aware of the act of painting, because he would go back in, right, to these dark areas or areas in here, and and he would just plunk in the intense color of the sky that was supposed to be back there, just right on top, right? Not making any effort to make it look like it's flat or it should be behind. Our eye, through color, our eye just does the work, and we're like, oh yeah, that's the sky. That's the sky back there. But at the same time, it's still a very strong positive mark stuck right on top of the tree. And it just works so well. And it made me realize that there was so much more about the relationships of positive and negative that I had. I mean, this was back when I was like in my 20s, and I realized that there was so much more I needed to learn. And it's a hard thing, because so much of the learning is nonverbal. Like it's about feel, right? It's like the feel of that shape as a shape, and why that's such a beautiful, gorgeous thing, and why the way it's painted, the way those marks kind of swoosh and push, right, plays up the fact that that's an interesting negative space shape. So here's some more examples of artwork really being about negative and positive space, right? We could look at this painting and think, maybe we'll start there. We could look at like Madame X and think it's just about, a woman in a pretty dress, right? She's a fancy woman, it's a fancy dress. She looks like she's kind of at a fancy party. But it's so much about the positive and negative shapes. It's so simply reduced, right? And like that sweep of her nose is beautiful in part because what kind of shape it cuts out of that negative space, which is such a beautiful color. Like it's hard for me to even figure out exactly. I know there's a lot of raw umber in there, but like what other colors were layered over the top of the raw umber is a little bit hard for me to figure out. Um, and then probably even more explicit would be, think about this photograph and how much like that right there, that's a shape. That's an interesting, exciting shape, right? It's really beautiful. And then that's also an interesting shape, right? And then we have this shape right there. We have then this whole big shape wrapping around. And there's the positive shapes as well, but it's about this interaction between the positive and negative shapes. I do want to say The Deep is one of my favorite paintings by Jackson Pollock. And I adore it. It's so unlike so many like so much of his work, but I just think it's such a cool painting. So figure ground is everywhere. Once you really start thinking about it, you realize how critical it is to thinking about art and the way art works. And like I said, it's like figure ground is the one thing that is not an art element or a design principle that you can almost always count on as being taught in a design class. And there's a reason for that, because it's just so critical for helping people to learn to think in a design way, is learning to see positive and negative. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. And I guess no one joined me all the way through, which is fine. For those of you in the class, I will see you later. Thanks.